Millionaire politician humiliates his ex-wife on national TV. Little did he know she would go public with his triplets. He never acknowledged. Now he's speechless. Sarah Harris was sweating. She was on air, live, with millions of eyes fixed on her. The topic was politics, government corruption, nothing out of the ordinary for someone who had faced tougher interviews. But David Mitchell, seated before her, had something else in mind. What he said, his voice steady and a slight smile on his lips, changed everything. You've always known how to use your resources, Sarah. It's no wonder you rose so fast. We all know how certain doors open, he said, crossing his arms, staring at her like he was casting a venomous bait. Sarah froze. The script for the interview flew out of her head. The cameras stayed on. The sound technician looked to the director. The director stared at the floor. No one moved. The studio fell into thick silence, as if everyone there was waiting for her downfall. Live on national television. Her breath hitched for a moment, what felt like an eternity. But Sarah didn't blink. She didn't tremble. A warm wave washed over her, but she remained steady. With controlled movement, she adjusted the mic, clipped to her lapel, took a deep breath, and regained control. Let's continue, David. This interview is about the corruption scheme in the Ministry of Health, not about gossip, she replied, her tone sharp as a knife. He gave her a cynical smile but backed off. The damage, however, had already been done. In the following minutes, social media erupted. Sarah Harris's name was on every trending topic in Mexico. The comments were cruel, misogynistic, spreading like wildfire. Of course she got where she is. Now it makes sense. Only those who don't want to see, won't see. She knew the internet was a court with no judge, but it hurt. Each word was a knife. Still, she finished the interview with the same composure she had started. Professional, firm, not falling into his game. In the dressing room, the smeared makeup no longer mattered. Her eyes were dry. No tears, just exhaustion. She picked up her phone, avoided opening social media, but couldn't ignore the private messages. Fellow journalists, some public figures, voices of support trying to put out a fire with buckets of hope. One message in particular made her stop. He's always been afraid of you. The message came from an unsaved number, but Sarah knew who it was from. The phrase echoed in her head. David was afraid. He always had been. From the moment he realized she was smarter, sharper, more dangerous than he would ever be. That wasn't just a provocation, it was a desperate attempt at defense, and that changed everything. She left the station in silence, driving through the streets of Los Angeles, the city lights passing by like shadows through the window. She didn't listen to music, didn't hear a thing. Only her thoughts mingled with memories that refused to die. When she got home, she parked carefully, turned off the car and took a deep breath. When she opened the door, they were there. 3 small faces waiting for her. Ethan, 5 years old, was the most serious. Mason, 3, was on the floor with blocks. And Henry, barely over a year old, was asleep in the nanny's arms. Ethan looked at her with attentive eyes, too mature for his age. Did he do something again? She didn't answer. She just knelt and hugged them tightly, pulling all 3 to her as if she could protect them from the world. Deep down, she always knew this moment would come. She just didn't expect it to be in such a cruel way, with millions watching. At the newsroom of Revista Observer, Stephen Thomas watched the backlash with sharp eyes. He knew Sarah wasn't the type to let this slide. He grabbed his phone and called. If you want to react, now's the time. I have space for you. Cover story. Hours later, Sarah walked through the house in silence. The boys were already asleep. She went to the desk in the office, opened the locked drawer, and pulled out a small red USB drive. It was tiny, almost insignificant, but inside it was the past David Mitchell had tried to erase. Recordings, photos, screenshots, evidence, and she knew this was going to change everything. Sarah held the red USB drive tightly, as if she could erase the past by squeezing it harder, but she knew she couldn't, not after everything, and most of all, not after him. Slowly, she closed the drawer as if she were closing a chapter of her own life. But the truth was, that story had started much earlier, 5 years earlier to be exact. Dallas was hot that early September. The dry air carried the smell of warm asphalt mixed with the intense activity around the convention center. Sarah, with her press pass hanging around her neck and a clipboard under her arm, walked among groups of reporters and aides. She was there to cover the national convention of the National Unity Party, one of the most important assignments of her career up until that point. She was ready, focused, ambitious. She hadn't met David Mitchell yet. That afternoon's debate had been tense. Candidates attacking each other publicly, rehearsed jabs, fiery speeches. During the break, Sarah headed to the cafe of the hotel, adjacent to the convention center, seeking a moment of silence and caffeine. That's when she saw him for the first time. David stood by the counter, holding an espresso in one hand and his phone in the other. When he looked at her, she didn't have to ask his name. "You're Sarah Harris, aren't you?" he asked with a smile that seemed casual but carried a sharp attention. She nodded, wary. It wasn't uncommon for her to be recognized, but there was something different in his gaze. He seemed to know more than he let on. "That article you published last week about the fraudulent contracts," he continued, leaning in slightly. "Many important people lost sleep over it." Sarah raised an eyebrow, intrigued. He introduced himself, David Mitchell, communications coordinator for the progressive wing of the party. Young, articulate, with a calculated tone of voice, and a presence that commanded attention, even in silence. She hesitated when he invited her to join him for a casual conversation at a nearby table, but she agreed. The conversation shifted from politics to journalism, then to literature, cinema, and personal lives. David was ambitious, but charismatic. He knew how to compliment without sounding insincere. He knew how to listen, which surprised Sarah. In the following days, they crossed paths more often in the convention corridors, at evening events, at dinners with guests. The glances between them lingered longer. The conversations became more intimate. What began as curiosity turned into tension, and soon it became a secret. One sweltering night after Sarah published an article exposing embezzlement in the Election Commission, David waited for her in the hotel parking lot. His face was tense, his eyes more intense under the streetlights. "I need to show you something," he said, holding the door to her car before she could get in. She hesitated, but she went. The hotel room was small, simple, impersonal. But what happened there was anything but. The intensity with which they looked at each other before any touch spoke louder than 1,000 words. It wasn't passion, it was a shared escape, a silent pact between two opposing worlds. When Sarah left hours later, she felt that something inside her had changed. In the following days, David didn't pull away. Quite the opposite, he became closer, more present, though still hiding it from the others. He whispered promises. He said he'd leave the campaign soon, that he wanted to build something real. And Sarah believed him. Then came the job offer in Bogota, a position as an international correspondent. The dream of any journalist. But she hesitated. David took her hand and said, "Stay. We still have so much ahead." Shortly after, on a rainy morning, Sarah felt a sudden wave of nausea. She ignored it, thought it was the coffee, the stress. On the third day, she bought a test. Alone in the hotel bathroom, she saw the red line appear. Sarah didn't cry. She didn't smile. She just felt a new weight settle inside her body. She tried calling David once, twice, 7 times. She sent messages. He didn't respond. It was as if he had disappeared, as if he had erased himself, and that she could never forgive. If you're watching this far, I'm sure you're liking it, so I want to ask you to subscribe to the channel. It was impossible that he had simply disappeared. Something didn't add up. She persisted. She called his personal number, tried the communication team's number, even the party's secretary. Always the same response. The congressman is traveling. No published agenda, no destination, no expected return. The security guards at the entrance to the party's headquarters, already familiar with her presence, kept up the polite routine, but their eyes avoided hers. It was as if they knew something they couldn't or didn't want to say. Determined, Sarah went to the campaign's central committee in downtown Dallas. The atmosphere was tense, corridors full, phones ringing non-stop. She was still wearing dark jeans and a button-up shirt with the sleeves rolled up, but she didn't feel like a reporter anymore. She felt lost. Before she could reach the reception, a tall, slender woman, impeccably dressed, intercepted her. It was as if she had been waiting for her. "The congressman is not available," she said bluntly without preamble. Sarah took a step back. The woman kept a calm tone, but there was an underlying aggressiveness beneath the surface. Her gaze was firm, cold. "Could you please deliver this note? It's personal. He'll want to read it." The woman, who had not introduced herself, simply crossed her arms. "I can't do that." "Just ask him to call me," Sarah insisted, extending the folded paper. The woman didn't even look at the hand outstretched towards her. "The congressman is busy." Sarah stood still for a moment. Then she tucked the note into her pocket, turned around, and left. The sound of the glass door closing behind her marked the end of something she didn't yet know how to name. Inside, the woman watched Sarah walk away down the sidewalk. She pulled out her phone. There was a recent message from Sarah's number. She read it quickly, deleted it, and blocked the contact. She smiled with disdain. Isabella Roberts was not surprised by women like Sarah. She knew how to deal with them. The following months were long. Sarah Harris's name disappeared from the headlines. The sharp, promising reporter was swallowed up by silence. She moved to a small apartment in Albany, far from the media spotlight and the buzz of the city. There, she relearned how to live with less. She sold the car, cancelled interviews and invitations, reduced her life to the essentials. Her belly grew. Sarah avoided looking at herself in the mirror for too long, until, during a routine ultrasound, the doctor, her eyes fixed on the screen, furrowed her brow. "There are 3, Señorita Harris." Sarah blinked. "What?" "3 hearts beating. Triplets." She didn't know whether to laugh or cry. In the end, she did both. Fear came like a wave. But something new also emerged. Courage. A courage she hadn't known she possessed. She made a decision that same week. She would no longer seek David out, not out of pride, but out of instinct. A mother's instinct. She began setting up the nursery with simple furniture. She painted the walls white with the help of her mother. She chose the names on a sleepless night between memories and possible futures. Ethan, Mason, Henry. The birth came early. Emergency. Pain. Blood. Cold. Sarah entered the room alone, holding only her own breath. There was no time to think about anything, just to endure. And then 3 cries, 3 tiny bodies, 3 lives. When she held them for the first time, Sarah felt a new weight, but it wasn't a burden. It was purpose. The pain from David still existed, but it was behind frosted glass. From that point on, he would only be the past. She looked at her children and whispered, her voice steady, choked with emotion. "I will never let anyone hurt you." The room still smelled of the hospital. Sarah, exhausted, watched the 3 children sleeping in makeshift cribs in the small house in Albany. The promise she had made that day, with her eyes on theirs, never stopped echoing inside her. And it was with that same silent commitment that almost 2 years later she decided to return. Not to the same journalism, nor with the same goals, but to that which still burned in her essence, telling stories that needed to be heard. She didn't return to the large newsrooms. She started with independent articles, published on alternative websites. No politics, no campaigns, no parties. Her focus was different now. Invisible communities, forgotten people, realities that didn't appear on the evening news. And thus, Sarah found her voice again. As she wrote about single mothers, displaced people, missing children, the boys grew around her. Ethan, the eldest, was a natural observer. He hardly asked questions, but was always nearby, paying attention to everything. Mason, on the other hand, was pure energy. He ran, climbed, fell, got up, always in motion. Henry had a world of his own. He drew with intensity, hid in cabinets, and spent long minutes staring at the clouds. Sarah divided her time between the words and the children, between the keyboard and the kitchen, between the silence of the night and the voices of chaotic mornings. Each part of the day had a function, a reason, an urgency. Little by little, Sarah reconnected with old colleagues and met new journalists, young, idealistic, full of the will to change the country. Among them was Stephen Thomas, an experienced editor with a critical eye and a solid reputation in the independent media. He was the one who, without promises, read Sarah's first articles. "You haven't lost your touch," he said, holding the paper with a rare smile. She smiled back, tired but confident. "I just had to learn to use it better." Stephen became a kind of silent mentor. He gave space, offered structure, challenged when necessary. He didn't want to know about her past. He wanted to know what she could write now. And Sarah needed that. Someone who looked at the present, not the old shards. Things were falling into place, slowly but steadily. Until one evening, Sarah was eating a slice of bread on the couch while the boys played on the floor when she saw Isabella Roberts on television. Beside her, in a grey suit and a ready smile, was David Mitchell, a federal congressman, popular, well-positioned in the polls. Sarah's stomach churned. The food lost its taste. The past came back like a slap. The image froze on the TV screen. It wasn't just his face. It was hers, there in the background, invisible, silenced. That very night, when the boys were asleep, Sarah sat down at the computer. She began sifting through old files, recordings, contacts. She reviewed emails, examined invoices. She remembered names. She called sources she should have forgotten. And little by little, a map began to form. A contact from Congress, an old acquaintance, sent her leaked documents. Sarah opened them with steady hands until she found what she didn't want to see. Illegal transfers, recognizable signatures, fraudulent contracts. Among the papers, there it was. David Mitchell. She didn't stop. She began assembling a dossier. She created folders, organized files, cross-checked information. In the first one, she wrote a name, David Mitchell. But she didn't just focus on the crimes. She also separated the old photos of the two of them, the emails exchanged behind the campaign scenes, the ultrasound images, proof of what he had tried to erase. One Sunday afternoon, while reviewing the files, Ethan entered the room without making a sound. He approached the desk, observing the monitor. "Mitchell," he read slowly. "Is he that guy from TV?" Sarah hesitated, her mouth dry, the words caught in her throat. "Yes," she replied, not hiding the weight in her voice. The boy stayed silent for a few seconds, then returned to the living room. Sarah stared at the screen, and she felt more strongly than ever that the time for silence was coming to an end. It was on a Tuesday morning that everything changed again. Sarah was finishing editing a piece about illegal housing when she received a link on her phone. It was from Stephen, a video. She clicked on it. David Mitchell, now campaigning for the Senate, was giving a speech at a live event. Amid rehearsed phrases he let slip, "The problem with the new generation starts at home. Single mothers, fatherless children." Broken families create broken citizens. Sarah paused the video at the exact moment he adjusted his microphone. Blood rushed to her head with a speed she hadn't felt in years. Her hands trembled, not out of fear, but out of indignation. The same man who disappeared without a backward glance, who never asked about the children, was now speaking about family structure as if he were an example. It was the height of hypocrisy, and she knew. She wasn't going to stay silent anymore. That night, with the boys asleep and the dossier still open on her computer, Sarah went live on her personal profile. The setting was simple. Dim light, the notebook camera. No makeup, no production. Just her. She spoke calmly, firmly, without mentioning any names, but the sentence was enough. It's curious to see certain politicians speak so much about family, when they've never even acknowledged their own children. She closed the notebook right after finishing the broadcast. She didn't expect such a huge reaction. Within hours, the video was clipped, reposted, subtitled. Comments flooded in by the thousands. Gossip websites began to speculate. Who is Sarah Harris talking about? Exclusive. Journalist might be exposing famous politician. She didn't say anything. Not yet. At David's campaign headquarters, the atmosphere became tense. Isabella Roberts, always alert, noticed the movement. She cancelled interviews, reinforced communication filters, and shielded the congressman as much as possible. But she couldn't control David. He was restless, irritated, increasingly paranoid. He called his staff, scoured old social media posts, demanded reports on Sarah. On the third night after the live video, Sarah received an anonymous call. He knows, and he's going to react. Be careful with what you have. The voice was male, firm, but muffled. Sarah didn't respond. She just hung up. The next day, Stephen knocked on her door. He entered without saying much, as he always did. Are you ready? I don't know if I'll ever be, Sarah replied. Then we go anyway. He proposed a series of reports based on the leaked documents. Sarah hesitated. She was scared, yes, for her safety, for the children. But she also knew this was bigger than her. It's dangerous, Stephen. Exactly why it's necessary. They assembled a parallel team, people they trusted. Freelance reporters from other states, digital security programmers, independent editors. They used pseudonyms, encryptions, rented rooms on the side. No one could know who was behind the articles. The first publications came out quietly, almost silently, but the content spoke for itself. Names of shell companies, rigged tenders, inflated contracts. David was mentioned, but still no direct evidence. Even so, the damage began. On social media, Sarah's name began circulating again. Some applauded her, others attacked. She received flowers and threats on the same day, but now she wasn't backing down. On the last page of the third report came the final blow. An unpublished photo. David and Sarah, years ago, sitting side by side in a cafe in Dallas. He was smiling. She was, too. 2 days after the article was published, he called an emergency press conference. The hall was filled with cameras, journalists, and skeptical allies. David appeared tense, his gaze darker than usual, his gestures sharp. The speech, hastily prepared, mixed indignation and anger. There is a clear attempt to emotionally manipulate me, he began without beating around the bush. Personal attacks, baseless insinuations, media inventions, all meant to tarnish my reputation at a delicate electoral moment. He didn't mention Sarah's name, but the target was obvious. He spoke of blackmail, opportunism. He said he would never shy away from responsibility, but he wouldn't accept being the target of a fabricated narrative. His advisors were in disarray. The public saw a man who, for the first time in years, had lost control. Isabella Roberts watched from the side of the stage, arms crossed, her face impassive, her eyes fixed on the main camera. She didn't move. She didn't correct David. She didn't interrupt him. She was there for another reason. Every word he said was being recorded, analyzed, calculated by her. She had plans, many plans, and Sarah knew this. Meanwhile, in the living room of her house in Albany, the three boys were watching the broadcast on the news. As always, Ethan was the first to react. Eyes fixed on the screen, his voice low, certain. "He's my dad, right?" Sarah, standing behind the couch, took a few seconds to respond. There was no more escaping, no more protection in the lie. She just nodded. Ethan lowered his eyes. He didn't say anything else. Mason, sitting beside him, exploded. "He's an idiot! Why did you like him?" Henry didn't say a word. He was sitting with his notebook on his lap, drawing a faceless figure covered in red strokes. Sarah turned off the TV. She sat down with all three of them on the floor. It was time. No more beating around the bush. No more fluff. "I liked the man he pretended to be, before I knew what he really was," she said, looking each of them in the eyes. "But you're not part of that. You were born from what was real. After that, everything became a lie." None of them interrupted. Even Mason was silent. Meanwhile, in a commercial building in downtown Los Angeles, Isabella was orchestrating a full legal offensive. She contacted a network of lawyers, filed notifications, demanded retractions. She wanted to stop Sarah from continuing to publish, but the documentation was solid, and the children were even more solid. There was no argument that could erase real faces. David began facing pressure from within his own party. Tough conversations, veiled accusations. One of his oldest allies was blunt. "Did you hide triplets for 5 years?" He tried to deny it, said there was no proof. But the media wasn't waiting for confessions. The following week, a video went viral from an independent channel. A facial recognition expert compared public photos of Ethan with old images of David. The similarities were striking. The video was shared by millions. The country was divided. Sarah became a symbol of resistance, of courage. David became the portrait of political hypocrisy. The elections were approaching, and the crisis only grew. The debates, once tame, now revolved around personal scandals. It was then that one quiet night, Sarah received a call from Stephen. "It's time. It's now or never." She closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and she knew there was no turning back. She would go all the way. There was no more time for hesitation. Sarah spent the night reviewing each paragraph, checking each piece of data, each piece of evidence. By 7 in the morning, with the boys still asleep, she clicked the publish button. The definitive article was live. The Forgotten Children of David Mitchell, the title direct, the content unquestionable. It contained old images, screenshots of conversations, medical exams, handwritten notes, receipts from consultations, ultrasound records, and photos from the first months of the triplets' lives. All dated, signed, documented. No doubt remained. The report was not just an accusation, it was a timeline of abandonment, and now it was public. Less than 10 minutes later, the site went down. First, it slowed down. Then, an error message appeared. Hacker attack. Sarah knew immediately. Stephen confirmed by message. The server had been hacked, but it was too late. Independent journalists from across the country had already mirrored the article. The content was spreading like wildfire, on Twitter, on Telegram, in podcasts, on stories. The truth couldn't be erased anymore. On the other side of the city, in the backstage of a party event, David received the news while still wearing his microphone on his suit. His assistant whispered in his ear. Within seconds, his face fell. Sweat, tremors, a lost gaze. "Get out," was all he could say before turning and disappearing behind the curtain. Backstage, locked in a room with a mirrored glass, David sank into an armchair. Isabella entered shortly after and grabbed him by the arms firmly. "We'll reverse this. There's still time. Trust me." But he wasn't listening anymore. He mumbled disconnected things. He talked about his childhood, his strict father, his wrong choices. He was on the edge of collapse. He began drinking compulsively. He missed meetings. He cancelled debates. He started to distrust everyone around him. He screamed at his team, who began abandoning him one by one. The fall, which had been slow, gained speed. Meanwhile, Sarah turned down interview invitations, TV programs, radio stations, foreign newspapers. Everyone wanted to hear her version. She thanked them, but declined. "I don't want fame," she said. "I want respect and justice for my children." Even without speaking, her image spread across the world. A report by the BBC showed the scandal shaking Mexican politics. At the end of the report, a photo taken by a photographer, Sarah crossing a plaza with the 3 boys. Ethan was holding her right hand, Henry and Mason the left. It was a simple scene, but full of strength. With public and judicial pressure growing, a judge finally authorized the DNA test request. David tried to appeal. He claimed injured intimacy and political persecution, but he lost. The test would be done. The sample was collected in secrecy, but the location leaked. When David arrived at the lab, he found photographers surrounding the building. Too late. The image of him leaving the car, tense, head down, became headline news. 3 days later, the result. 99.9% genetic compatibility between David Mitchell and Ethan, Mason, and Henry. It was official. It was public. The country stopped. At home, Sarah sat on the floor with the boys. The TV was on. The silence was absolute. She didn't cry. She didn't smile. She just kept her arms around the 3 of them. Henry, in his small voice, without taking his eyes off the screen, said, "He really is our father." Sarah didn't respond. She just hugged her children tightly to her chest. The silence after the DNA confirmation wasn't a relief. It was a void. Sarah expected attacks, reactions, political movements. But what came was absence. David disappeared. He didn't give interviews, didn't publish videos, wasn't seen at events. For days, he vanished from the media as if he had evaporated. And in this interim, someone had to take up the commitments. Isabella Roberts took the lead with a near-surgical naturalness. She showed up at party events, spoke on his behalf, tried to maintain the narrative that everything was under control. But it wasn't. Allies began to distance themselves. His electoral base lost confidence. David's candidacy, which had seemed solid, began to crumble with every new appearance of Isabella without him. Meanwhile, Sarah felt the weight of exposure growing with each passing second. Reporters camped outside her building. Drones hovered over her balcony. Messages, calls, emails, everyone wanting more. More photos, more statements, more about the kids. "I've shown enough," she said to Stephen in a firm tone. "They're my children. They're not scandal trophies." Stephen understood, but he knew it wasn't going to stop, not without one more key piece. That's when he showed up. A middle-aged man, hoarse voice, former security guard on David's team. He contacted Stephen first, asked for confidentiality. Then he wanted to speak with Sarah. The meeting took place in the parking lot of a supermarket, inside a car with the windows rolled up. "I remember you," he said directly. "You went to the committee. You looked desperate. You tried to leave a note." Sarah nodded silently. The memory was vivid. Isabella gave clear instructions. "If this woman shows up, tell them the congressman is traveling, and never write down her name, never record anything. She was to remain non-existent." She stayed silent. The man looked ahead, thoughtful. "I stayed quiet because I thought he knew. Now I see that maybe he didn't know anything." Sarah asked for permission to record. He agreed. The testimony aired the following morning. Stephen edited the video, preserving the man's identity but keeping the essence. The headline was direct: impossible to ignore. David's advisor sabotaged contact with mother of his children. The article included the video, the transcript, and excerpts from the previous report. It was the final blow to Isabella's image. David watched the video in silence, sitting in the dark of the apartment where he was hiding. The words from the former security guard echoed more than any headline. "She would do that without telling me," he murmured to himself, eyes fixed on the screen. When Isabella arrived, she already knew something had changed. She tried to maintain control, as always. "I did what was necessary for your career. You thanked me back then. You said it was the right thing." David took a long time to respond. When he spoke, it was without raising his voice. "I thanked you. Or did you convince me it was the right thing?" She didn't answer. They both knew the truth. At Sarah's house, the atmosphere was also changing, but in a different way. The boys were quieter, more attentive. Ethan, as always, was the first to ask. "Is he coming here?" Mason added, "Is he going to want to live with us?" Henry, drawing in the corner of the room, looked up, curious. Sarah took a deep breath. She sat down on the floor, between the three of them. "I don't know. I don't know what he wants, and I don't know what I'm ready to let happen." The boys nodded, each in their own way. They didn't demand answers. They just wanted honesty, and that Sarah could still give. Sarah sat alone for a while, staring at the emptiness of the room. The silence that followed felt different. It was no longer the silence of waiting. It was the silence of impact. The truth had already been spoken. And now, the consequences were coming from all sides. The conservative base of David's party was the first to tremble. Evangelical pastors and Catholic bishops, long-time allies, began to speak out with short, harsh phrases. Hypocrisy has its limits. An absent father is no example of family. Important business people cancelled events and support dinners. The image he had so carefully built, based on morals and traditional values, was crumbling before everyone. Outside the party headquarters, protests began. Small on the first day, but gaining strength by the hour. Women held up signs with the faces of the triplets, printed in black and white, with the phrase, "They deserve more." The images went viral across all social media. It was no longer just a political contest. It was a collective cry. A group of single mothers organized a spontaneous movement. They created the hashtag Somos Todas Sarah, we are all Sarah. In less than 24 hours, thousands of women began sharing stories of abandonment, invisibility, and resistance. The debate took over the country. TV programs, podcasts, opinion columns. Everyone was discussing not just the scandal, but what it revealed about the structure of power, about machismo, about the place of women in politics and society. Sarah watched everything from afar, trying to protect her children from what might come. She was approached by an international documentary producer. They offered a trip, interviews, resources. She declined politely but firmly. "I don't want to be a symbol," she told Stephen. "I just want to be a mother, in peace." On the other side, Isabella was trying to put out the fire. She sought out old allies, offered deals, tried to silence smaller outlets in exchange for exclusive access. But the damage had already been done. The truth was spread across dozens of independent voices, beyond the control of any narrative. David, at home, remained isolated. He had tried to write a letter to Sarah. He started, stopped, scratched out words, tried again. In the end, he ripped the paper into pieces. He didn't know where to start. He didn't even know if he had the right to try. At Sarah's house, the impact came in a different way. Ethan drew the day of the DNA test collection. On the paper, the father held a cotton swab, his eyes empty. Henry took the drawing and carefully drew tears falling down David's face. Mason took the same paper and traced a red crayon around everything. When Sarah saw it, she understood. The children didn't see the same figure. Each one carried a different pain. The arguments began, small but frequent. One wanted the father to come, another said he never wanted to see him. The third remained silent, as if trying to figure out who was right. Sarah realized the battle was now inside her own home, an emotional wound open in all three. Stephen suggested they seek help. She agreed. A child therapist started visiting the house twice a week. After a few sessions, Sarah asked directly, "Are they angry at him?" The therapist responded carefully, "Not exactly. They're afraid that all of this will turn into abandonment again." At night, when the boys were asleep, Sarah stayed alone in her room. She opened an old folder on her computer. There she found the messages she had sent to David 5 years ago. Some were tender words, others desperate. She read them all, one by one. She cried, but she didn't look back. The next morning, Sarah was still picking up the toys scattered around the living room when her phone vibrated insistently. Stephen had sent just one message: "Turn on the TV, now!" She obeyed. The channel was broadcasting nationally. The screen displayed a neutral background, no flags, no logos, and sitting in front of the camera, David, alone. No Isabella, no makeup. His dark circles were evident from sleepless nights. His voice came out shaky, restrained, different from the usual authoritative tone. "I've made mistakes, many of them, and I won't try to justify them. I just want to ask for forgiveness, especially from 3 people," he said, looking directly into the camera. Sarah stood still. For a moment, she wondered if he would actually say their names. He didn't. He continued the speech, measured, emotional to the right extent. He talked about children, responsibilities, and late shame, and that was it. Minutes later, the programs began to replay the segment. Commentators discussed the tone change. The public reacted on social media. But Sarah wasn't fooled. "This is damage control, nothing more," she said, sitting next to Stephen, who was watching everything from the newsroom. He gave an affirmative gesture. "Curious, though," he commented thoughtfully. "He didn't mention you, just the kids." Sarah didn't respond. She didn't need to. "Maybe he's still ashamed of what he feels for you," Stephen added, without lifting his eyes from the screen. On the other side of the city, Isabella watched the broadcast standing up in the corner of an improvised office. She hadn't been consulted nor warned. She watched it all with her jaw clenched. There was no double meaning in that exclusion. She was being left aside. Hours later, she called an impromptu press conference. No filter, no strategy. "I did what was necessary," she declared to the press, "and I did it under direct orders from Congressman David Mitchell. Everything he denies today was planned with me." The impact was immediate. The party issued a statement within 2 hours. Isabella Roberts was officially removed from the campaign. The same day, the public ministry announced the opening of an inquiry for obstruction of communication and document fraud. Sarah read the headlines with a bitter taste in her mouth. She felt that everything was turning into a game of passing the buck, and she muttered quietly, almost as if thinking aloud, "She's guilty, yes, but he let it happen. He wanted it to be easy to erase." That night, David called. He got straight to the point. He asked to see the children. Sarah listened in silence. Then she took a deep breath. "They are not part of a spectacle. They're children. They'll need time, and so will I." Outside the room, Ethan listened, leaning against the wall. When Sarah hung up, he entered slowly. He sat on the floor near her. "I want to see him, but not now," he said, with the calm of someone who had already understood more than he should have. Sarah cried, silently, without gestures. She just let the tears fall while her son leaned against her shoulder. The next day, Stephen brought a proposal. It's time to close this. One last chapter, an interview. Just you, just your voice. Sarah looked at him for a few seconds. She knew the weight of that, what it meant, what it would open. "I agree," she said, "but with one condition, no editing, none." Stephen nodded, and in that instant she knew she was ready to tell everything, from start to finish, no cuts. Sarah adjusted the microphone clipped to the collar of her shirt and looked at the camera, while the team adjusted the sound and lighting. The room they had chosen was simple, cozy, with a discreet bookshelf in the background. No excessive production, just her, the story, and the truth. The interview began in silence. Stephen, positioned behind the cameras, gave a slight nod. Sarah took a deep breath. "I was erased," she said calmly. "As a woman, as a professional, as a human being. They tried to convince me that what I lived through didn't exist, but I refused to disappear." For almost an hour, Sarah recounted everything. How she met David, the beginning of their relationship, the abandonment, the pregnancy, the isolation. She talked about the hardships, the sacrifices, the sleepless nights with 3 babies and no support. She spoke of how she rebuilt her life with dignity, without waiting for anyone to save her. She held a photo of her children in her lap, now folded at the edges from time. "They are the best thing that ever happened to me, and they were never a secret. They were protected, which is very different." There was no anger in her tone, just truth, firm, steady, not seeking pity. When the interview ended, the studio fell silent for a few seconds. Stephen knew it was one of those statements that would echo for decades. That night, the broadcast set records for viewership. Social media was flooded with messages of support. People cried, others shared similar experiences. Some said they felt less alone after hearing Sarah. She hadn't expected such a reaction, but she received it with serenity. On the other side, in a hotel room in downtown Los Angeles, David watched alone, sitting on the edge of the bed, shirtless, with the remote control in hand. The TV illuminated the dark room. He watched it all in silence. When the interview ended, his team began sending messages. "We need to come up with a response," one assistant texted. "You can't stay silent." David simply typed a short sentence. "Anything I say now will sound like a lie, and maybe it is." At Sarah's house, the triplets didn't watch the entire interview. Sarah chose to show them only the final segment, where she spoke about her children. Ethan held Henry's hand, paying attention. Mason pretended to be bored but didn't blink. When it finished, no one spoke. But Sarah knew they had understood. Hours later, when the house was quiet, Sarah heard a noise at the door. She cautiously went to answer. On the floor, there was a brown envelope with no sender. Inside, a black-covered notebook, a diary, in David's handwriting. She sat down on the sofa, her hands still trembling, and began to read. It was filled with notes written during the time they had been together. Fragments, unspoken reflections, unsent texts. In one of the excerpts, she read aloud, without realizing, "You turn me into someone I still don't know how to be. And that scares me." She closed the diary abruptly. Emotions flooded in all at once. Anger, frustration, pity. But what she felt most was the weight of having loved someone who never really knew how to love. She tucked the notebook into the bottom of the drawer where she kept the children's documents. She didn't show it to them. Not yet. Maybe one day, when everything wasn't so broken, when the words didn't hurt so much. David's diary remained locked away, forgotten at the bottom of the drawer. Sarah hadn't opened it since that night, not out of fear, but because she understood that some truths needed time to settle. In the meantime, the world around her continued to spin, collapsing for some, reinventing itself for others. A few days after the interview, the party issued an official statement, brief, impersonal. David Mitchell no longer had institutional support. His candidacy was, in practice, over. He had become a wounded bird in national politics, still alive, but without a sky. No coalition wanted to associate their name with the scandal. Sponsors evaporated. He was now referred to only as ex-candidate. Isabella, on the other hand, decided she wouldn't fall alone. Now, under investigation, with lawsuits piling up, she began to make veiled threats in short interviews, in meetings in the halls of Congress, in cryptic messages to journalists. She claimed to have dossiers on corruption involving important figures within her own party and rival ones. The first insinuation was enough to create chaos in Congress. Offices were locked, phones were exchanged. No one knew how far she would go, and that made her dangerous. Amid the political turmoil, Sarah's name started to appear in the fiery speeches of conservative lawmakers. She was called an instrument of the left, an agent of family destabilization, a threat to moral order. Sarah heard one of these segments on the radio in the car while taking the boys to school. She laughed. "Not even on my best days have they given me this much credit," she said, while Mason asked if destabilization was a curse word. International recognition soon came. The United Nations, through a journalism ethics committee, sent a formal invitation for Sarah to participate in a forum in New York. She declined. She thanked them politely but firmly. "I prefer to be home with my children. They've already waited for me long enough." Little by little, her own children began turning their pain into creation. Ethan, the most introspective, started writing a small book in secret. He called it "The Things I Never Said Aloud." Sarah only found out when she found some printed pages in his backpack. Mason, with his boundless energy, decided to start a YouTube channel with Stephen's help. The focus was teaching children how to deal with anger. He used stories, games, and small dramatizations, everything with humor and sensitivity. Henry, on his part, used what he loved most, drawing. He created a series of comics with families made up of a mother and 3 children, 2 grandfathers, an aunt, and a dog. He showed that love sometimes seemed messy, but it always fit. The growth of all 3 on social media was organic, spontaneous. Sarah set boundaries from the beginning. Fame doesn't heal pain, and too much exposure hurts. David, in silence and away from the spotlight, began therapy sessions. He went twice a week. He spoke little at first, until one day, during one of these sessions, the doctor asked, "What do you regret?" David stared at the floor, then at the window. Everything and nothing. In the newsroom, Stephen received a proposal from a major studio to adapt Sarah's story into a fiction series. He called her excited. "This isn't entertainment, Stephen," Sarah replied, with a tone that left no room for discussion. "It's a wound that's still open." However, she authorized another idea, a book. An autobiography with educational purposes aimed at young journalists, teachers, and students, with one condition: that it serves so that other Sarahs don't have to scream as loud to be heard. The book, authorized by Sarah, was already in the final stages of editing when the months passed, with a strange silence in the air. The political tension finally began to dissipate. Isabella was still out of the spotlight, involved in investigations that seemed to drag on, and David's name had stopped being a constant presence in the headlines. Public opinion had found new targets. But between Sarah and David, even with everything quiet, the wound still throbbed, not on social media, in the background, in the memories. One Saturday morning, a letter arrived, handwritten, on smooth paper, with no logo, just Sarah's name in the corner. It was from David. Not for her, but for the children. She sat alone in her room, the letter in her hands. She read it slowly. It was a hesitant text, full of pauses, written with care. David spoke about fear, shame, and longing. He didn't promise anything. He didn't put himself in the position of a victim. It was an attempt, raw, incomplete, but honest, to be heard. Sarah held on to the letter for 2 days before handing it to the children. She waited for the right moment. When she gave it to them, she simply said, "It's from someone you know, and who took too long to write." The three of them read it together, sitting on the floor. The reading was silent, dense. Ethan was the first to fold the paper. He carefully tucked it inside the notebook where he wrote his stories. Mason stood up with watery eyes and shouted, "Why didn't he come here to say that to our faces?" Sarah didn't answer. She knew that any explanation would be a futile attempt to ease what hurt too deeply. Henry, on the other hand, held the sheet with both hands, emotional. His handwriting is beautiful. He cried quietly without sobs. Sarah hugged all three of them at the same time. No answer was simple, no pain was the same. And there, in that pile of small bodies and immense emotions, she knew there was no avoiding the next step. 2 days later, the phone rang. It was him. Sarah answered. David's voice sounded different, low, less sure, but without rehearsals. They talked for 22 minutes. No one shouted. No one asked for forgiveness. They didn't talk about the past as if it could be erased, nor about the future as if there were guarantees. They just listened to each other, for the first time, without shields. David asked to see the children. Sarah didn't promise anything, but she suggested a meeting, a public park, a simple, open place with no press, no cameras. Just a neutral ground. She set the date, told him the time, and hung up. On the appointed day, he arrived on time. He wore jeans, a light blue shirt, old sneakers. No accessories, no assistants. He had a look on his face that made it clear he didn't know where to put his hands. He stood up next to a wooden bench. Sarah stayed at a distance, watching. The boys arrived shortly after, walking together. Ethan, serious. Mason, impatient. Henry, with a toy in his hand. Ethan was the first to speak. "We don't need to like you, but you need to learn not to run away." David lowered his head and replied, without irony, without defense, "I'm trying. For the first time in my life, I'm trying." Mason turned his back, arms crossed. Henry approached slowly. He extended his hand. David took it carefully, like someone afraid of breaking something too fragile. From a distance, Sarah watched. She didn't smile. She didn't cry. She just watched. And in that moment, she saw something she had never seen before, all four of them together. She understood, with the clarity that comes from difficult moments, that it wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't reconciliation, but it was the beginning of something. Maybe hope. She knew that for the children, this meant much more than it did for her. It was about them. And it was for them that she would allow the next step. The reconnection was slow. There were no grand gestures, no beautiful words. David started to show up on Sundays always at the same time. He would come with his pockets full, but nothing extravagant. Storybooks for Henry, balls and board games for Mason, and lots of questions, mostly for Ethan, who rarely answered immediately. He watched, pondered, and then, with short phrases, would accept the dialogue. The boys, of their own accord, set rules. No lies, no promises he didn't intend to keep. They didn't want to hear vows, they wanted actions. Sarah listened to everything and agreed, but she made sure not to intervene. The space was theirs, the rhythm was theirs. On a grey afternoon, while the boys were at school, David arrived early. He was holding a book in his hands, but said it wasn't for any of the children. He wanted to talk. With Sarah. Alone. She thought for a few seconds before agreeing. They sat on the back porch where the sounds of the street barely reached them. For long minutes, neither of them said a word. The silence was heavy but necessary. "Do you still hate me?" he asked suddenly, without looking into her eyes. Sarah didn't take long to respond. No, hate takes more energy than I'm willing to spend on you. David nodded. There was no offense in her reply, just sincerity. Do you think, is there still room? He tried again, unsure. She was direct, as always. There's no going back. What's done is done. But maybe one day there can be respect, and that would be enough. David didn't insist. He took an envelope from his pocket and handed it to her. It's the official copy of the paternity acknowledgement, registered, no legal pressure, no lawyers. Sarah took the envelope, opened it slowly, and read the document carefully before putting it away. You should have done this years ago, he nodded without ready excuses. I didn't know how to be a man. I was only a politician. Later that same day, Ethan found out about what his father had said. He jotted it down in his notebook between the chapters of the small book he was writing. Being a father is harder than winning an election, but much more valuable. Mason reacted differently. He sat with his pens and scribbled a face with thick lines, crooked, slightly blurred. I still don't know what he is to me, he said, without lifting his eyes. Henry, on the other hand, drew the four of them together, him, his brothers, and David. In the corner of the paper he wrote in trembling letters, Dad David. Sarah saw the three drawings at the end of the day. She carefully kept them in a transparent folder, just like the diary and the letter. She knew there was still much to live, much to adjust, but at that moment she realized something rare and simple. There was presence, and sometimes presence was enough. The following weeks passed as if time had finally learned to move at the pace of real life. There were no more daily headlines, no cameras at the door. The scandal had stopped being a spectacle and had become memory. But for Sarah, for David, and for the children, the healing process continued quietly in the details of everyday life. Sarah returned to her work with a different strength. She went back to investigative reporting, but now with more space, more voice, and above all, more freedom. She no longer had to prove anything to anyone. Her existence spoke for itself. Her words, when published, came like arrows to the heart, and no one dared to reduce her to a troublesome single mother. She was a journalist. She was a mother. She was free. The children continued growing, each in their own rhythm. Ethan with the serene seriousness of someone who had been born old. Mason, between noise and sensitivity, seeking to understand what he wanted from the world. Henry, with the eyes of an artist, transforming emotions into images and words before even understanding the right names for the feelings. They had doubts, anger, joy, and, most importantly, they were starting to make their own choices. David, far from politics, found a curious space. He began giving lectures on ethics, public responsibility, and the limits between image and truth. He was invited by universities, collectives, and institutions. Some laughed, skeptical. Others listened attentively. He would never be a unanimity again, but maybe he would never hide behind a character again. Stephen, in turn, published a book about the behind-the-scenes of it all. Not just the scandal, but the Mexican political machine. In the dedication, he wrote, "To Sarah Harris, truth is the daughter of courage." Sarah read the words and didn't respond. She just smiled faintly. Stephen knew she didn't like the spotlight, but he also knew that without her, that story would have never come out of the darkness. One evening, while attending a literature event in Dallas, Sarah crossed paths with Isabella. The two stood face to face after all these years. Isabella wore sunglasses and a light coat. She paused for a second. Sarah did the same. No words were exchanged, not a single one. But the silence between them was enough. What needed to be understood had been. The country continued to debate the case. Now, without the hysteria of the beginning, the story became a reference in discussions, seminars, and communications colleges, not as a scandal, but as a warning, as a lesson in structure, power, omission, and resistance. Amid this new scenario, a young, popular, transparent candidate emerged, someone people began to believe in again. And it was to him that Sarah wrote an open letter, published on her website and reproduced by several newspapers. Mexico deserves leaders who aren't afraid of the truth, who know how to listen, who know how to err, and who choose not to run away. Meanwhile, Ethan published his first book, the simple title, The Things I Never Said Out Loud. It became a bestseller among teenagers in less than a month. The book was about forgiveness, but not easy forgiveness. It was the kind of forgiveness that starts when you understand that loving someone doesn't require forgetting what that person did. In a small rented apartment, David watched his son's interview on TV. Ethan, sitting confidently, spoke about the book, about family, about identity. David cried. For the first time, he cried for real. No shame, no control. Sarah, on the other side of the city, also watched. She turned off the TV as soon as the interview ended. She walked to the boys' room. One by one, she kissed them. Ethan was sleeping with the book in his arms. Mason was listening to music with his headphones on. Henry had colored pencils scattered across the bed. Sarah turned off the light and closed the door slowly. For the first time in a long time, everything seemed at peace. The wounds had ceased to be open, but they hadn't disappeared. They had learned to exist in silence, like memories that no longer hurt, only teach. And it was like that years later that Sarah walked through a square in Oaxaca where the wind seemed calmer and her steps lighter. By her side, Ethan, now a young man, walked with the same calmness he had as a child. "Do they still talk about our story?" he asked with a half-smile and a curious look. Sarah stopped for a moment, looking at the movement around her. Children running, women selling crafts, tourists taking photos of colonial churches. She took a deep breath before answering. "They talk less, but what matters is that you grew up knowing who you are and who you don't need to be." Ethan smiled, this time more firmly. He knew exactly what his mother meant. Mason was now studying cinema at UNAM. He wanted to tell stories that no one dared to film. He spoke with passion about lighting, cuts, characters. He was restless, intense, but had found his place. Henry, always more introspective, had decided to study psychology. He wanted to understand the emotions he had carried since childhood and help other children name theirs. Ethan, for his part, was already a successful writer. He had published 3 books, all about identity, memory, and forgiveness. David saw them often, still discreetly, without forced intimacy. It was sometimes strange, sometimes awkward, but it was present, and the boys, now adults, knew how to deal with that presence. They didn't idealize him, but they didn't reject him either. They had created a new kind of bond, imperfect but real. Sarah continued writing. One day she published an article titled, "The Power Doesn't Erase Blood." It was a reflection on collective memory, family, and responsibility. The text went viral quickly, but this time without scandal. It was simply a living reminder of a story that marked a country and transformed a woman. Isabella lived abroad, according to rumors, in southern Spain. No one was sure. She had vanished from the media, avoiding public appearances. Sarah didn't feel anger nor longing. She just knew that certain stories don't have simple endings. Some people disappear before they are truly understood, and that was okay. Some time later, David published an open letter, simple, direct. It was for the country, but it seemed to be addressed to Sarah and the children as well. "I failed as a politician, and for a long time as a man, but I am a father. Today, I am a father," read one of the excerpts. The letter moved many people. Sarah read it alone, at the end of any given afternoon, and closed her eyes for a few seconds. He learned. Not in the right time, but he learned. It was during a literature event in Dallas that Ethan received an important award. As he walked up to the stage, in front of a full audience, he held the trophy firmly and said, "I dedicate this to my mother, for teaching me that the truth is more powerful than any speech." Sarah watched everything from home, alongside Mason and Henry. She cried, but not out of pain. This time, she cried out of peace. That story that had started with a denunciation, fed by struggle, and almost lost in the desire for vengeance, had transformed, not into a fairy tale, but into a journey of redemption, without forgetting what hurt, without erasing what had been lived, because no truth comes without scars. And Sarah finally had learned to live with them all.